Hello and welcome to this section on access modifiers. Let's look at what is the section objective and what you will learn in this section. You will understand what is access modifiers. We have seen public as of now. When you define a property, you define it as a public. Those are nothing but called as access modifiers. So we'll understand what are these access modifiers, and we'll work with example and understand two types of modifiers. One is public and one is private. Then we'll look at when to use which modifier in what cases and what are the real-time examples. These two access modifiers will help us. Okay. Then we'll do a comparison between public versus private and how the methods and the properties will behave. Then we'll work with exercises, interview question, resources, and practical tests to understand this concept better. Okay. So let's jump into the lecture now. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is access modifiers. So we'll understand what is this word access modifiers means. Well, access modifier helps to restrict the access of a property or a method. Well, there are three types of access modifiers. One is public, one is private, and one is protected. In this section, we're going to look only into public and private. In the next section, inheritance section, we will understand protected access modifier. Okay, so don't be confused when we don't see protected modifiers discussed in this section. It will be discussed in the next section with the concept of inheritance. As discussed, the main purpose of access modifiers is to help restrict the access of property or a method, which means let's say you have a car class and you have something called as engine as a property. You don't want anybody to change the engine type, right? You want to decide, maybe you want to hard code it inside the car class. And then you don't want anybody to change directly from outside by accessing that property via the object, right? So what you do is you create that engine property as private. So once you define as private, nobody can change it or access it from outside. So this is basically some kind of security that you are adding to you're also hiding some of the features that can be accessed from the object. Well, that is the main purpose of access modifiers. They help to hide the property and the method accessed from the object. So once you define anything as public, means it is public, it can be accessed via the object. Once you define anything as private, you cannot access it via the object. We're going to do an exercise and we're going to understand how these things work. Well, access modifiers help you to hide some of the things accessed via the object, right? You can hide property and also you can hide some methods. If you don't want anybody to call a method via the object, you can just mark them as private and nobody will be able to call that method from the object. Okay, so that's the purpose of the access modifiers. We will do two examples in this section, public and private, and protected. As I said, we will cover that in the next section. Okay, so let's go ahead and do some exercises to understand this access modifier. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to use public access modifier. So we'll write a class to understand how to use the public access modifier. Okay, so we'll start with a folder here, call it as modifiers, and this time we'll do an example, simple example to understand the access modifier. So we'll do a dog class. So we'll define a dog class here. We'll define two properties, and when you define a property, you have to mention access modifier. So this public is nothing but the access modifier. So we mention dog color and then the access modifier and then the breed of the dog, and we'll create two functions. One is the dog bark, another function is dog sleep. Okay, just for fun, right? Just to understand how the access modifier public works, but I think we already seen public by defining it to the property. Okay, let's try to access this now. So we'll say dog1 is equal to new dog, Okay, so because the property is mentioned as public, you can now access the properties directly. Okay, so you can say dog1 color is black. This is basically the breed of the dog. Okay, so this is done. So now let's call the methods. Okay, you can say dog1 okay, let's execute this. Okay, so it prints both of the echo that statements that we have written here. The most important thing is you can access the properties, you can also access the methods. Okay, but we haven't mentioned any access modifier here. So because we haven't mentioned any access modifier and we are able to access them, which means it is of type public. Okay, we'll see in the next lecture, we're going to see how public will differentiate with private, and then how it restricts the access to those properties and methods. But for now we have defined it as public, so you can access it via the object, and by default the function is marked it as public. You can still mark it as public here. Okay, there won't be any change, right? So by default methods are marked as public. For every property you have to mark it explicitly. Okay, so that's how the access modifiers work, and you cannot have access modifiers to a class. Okay, that will error out. Okay, so access modifiers can only be applied to property and to functions. Okay, so remember, if you're writing functions and you want it to be public, you don't have to specify the access modifier. And what is the purpose of access modifier? To hide the properties and methods. If you marked it as public, means you don't want to hide. If you mark it as private, then you want to hide it, which you're going to see in the next lecture. Okay, so that's all on this exercise on how to use public access modifier, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is private access modifier. We have seen public access modifier. Let's understand what is private access modifier. The way you define public or private access modifier is the same. You put it in the front, and the keyword is private, which you mention it in front of the property or in front of the method. Okay, so private is a keyword before property and methods. Private access modifier means it can be accessed only inside and cannot be accessed from outside the class. So when you define something as private, you can access that thing inside the class, but you cannot access via the object. Okay, that is from the outside the class. So remember the difference between public and private. Private will not allow any of the methods or properties to access it via the object from outside the class. Okay, it will still be accessible inside the class. You see the method here, getName. GetName is accessing the name. Even though you mention name as private, you can still access it inside the class. Okay, that's what means inside the class. Okay, so let's understand more about private access modifier. Methods and properties has to be marked private to make it private methods and properties. By default, methods are basically public, and when you define a property, you have to mention access modifier. And well, if you want to make a method as private, you have to explicitly mention that. Okay, private access modifiers can be applied only to class, properties and methods. Again, you cannot mention private to a class, you can only mention to property and methods. And modifiers are always placed in front, like we have seen in the public access modifier. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on private access modifier. Let's do an example and understand in detail. Okay, so let's do an exercise now. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define private access modifiers. Okay, so we'll use a doc example, and if you're already downloaded the material, go to materials folder, go access modifier, public and private, go to how to use private access modifiers, go to before folder, you will find a doc example. So start with this. So I'm going to start with this example. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to replace this file. Okay, and I'm going to use this as a starting point to understand the private access modifier. Okay, the first thing what I want to do is I want to mark them as private. Okay, so once you mark them as private means you cannot access them. Okay, let's do that example now. Okay, you cannot access a private property outside the class, means with an object you cannot access them, because now you have mentioned them as private. Okay, so why we have to mention a property as private, and how do you access them, right? How do you change them now? That's where the getter and the setter method comes in picture. If you remember, we have discussed about get and set methods in the this keyword section, wherein we have created getter and setter methods for a student class. Okay, now when you're trying to mention your properties as private, you have to provide a public getter and setter methods to change the value. It is a best practice to mark your property as private, and then you have a public getter and setter method to access that value and change that value. Okay, so quickly let's write the getter and setter methods for color and breed. You also keep a note of how the naming convention works. You cannot just write whatever format you want. The getter setter is basically industry standard, so you have to follow this naming convention and then write the getter setter methods. Okay, so first thing is you can choose to write public function, but you don't need it because by default the methods are for public. Okay, so you can write get and set. Okay, so two for one property and there's 2 for one property. Okay, so if it's a color property, then the first case should be uppercase. Okay, the get method doesn't really accept any value, but it returns the value, right? So it has string. The set basically have the value, so you can say color. Okay, it doesn't return anything. The get breed, similarly get will return something, and set will have breed. Okay, so let's implement one by one. So you have to return this, so you return $this and then you return the color. Remember that when you mark a property as private, you can still access them within the class, but now when you say return, the value of that property is written, not the property. Okay, you cannot access the property, so you're just passing the value of that property, okay, via this method. And how do you set? You can set okay, so that's how you basically write a private property, and then you write a public methods to change that value. And the naming convention and a standard format from the OOPs is basically to have a getter and a setter method. These are called as getter and setter methods. Getter method will get the value, setter method will set the value. Okay, and that's the naming convention. It has variable name attached to it, and the first letter is caps, and you're passing some value, and then that is assigned back to the actual property. So how do you assign this? So you can now say dog1 set color black, set breed okay. This is how you basically set the value. Okay, so I hope you understand how to use private access modifier, and once you mark property as private, you have to provide methods to set and get them. Okay, and that can be done with the getter and the setter method. and you should understand the access modifier will restrict the property or the method to be accessed from the object. Okay, if you want to do an example, you can just mark it as private. Okay, and you will get an error stating you cannot access that method because it is marked as private. Okay, but you can still call that from another method. Okay, you can say doc sleep. You can remove the doc sleep from here. Okay, you still get the same output. It's just that now it's a private method, so you are calling it from a public method. Okay, and then you give access to the public method so that you can call both the methods. Okay, so this is how you play around with public and private, and you have to understand when to use them. Okay, so in the next lecture we'll see what is the difference between public and a private access modifier and when to use them. Okay, so that's all on this lecture for how to use private access modifiers, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture on understanding the difference between public versus private. So we have understood public and private access modifiers. We have done some examples on it. So I hope it is pretty clear by now. We'll just do a quick recap and understand what is the difference between public and versus private. So public, when you want to allow access to property and methods from outside the class, you mark them as public. Any property or method you think, okay, it should be accessed via the object, then you mark it as public. When you want to restrict the access from outside, means from the object, you mark them as private. Okay, by default methods are public, and for private you have to specify them. Public property and methods can be accessed inside the class. Even the private property and methods can be accessed inside the class. Okay, remember this definition. And it's not a good practice to mark properties as public, whereas it's basically a good practice to mark properties as private and change the value using getter and setter methods. This is what we have seen just now. When we read a private doc class, we try to hide all the properties via the private access modifiers, and then we wrote as a getter and setter method to access them. Well, that's a good practice that you have to follow when you define a class. Okay, so that's the difference between public and private access modifier, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture on use case. So we'll try to use the employee class that we have created previously, and then we'll try to add some access modifier. We'll try to improve the code by putting some best practices there. Okay, so if you go to access modifier public and private, you will find the use case folder. So you have both before and after. So we'll try to start with before, and then we will end up into the after. Okay, so we'll try to modify the before folder file. We'll copy this. I'll go back to that folder, modifiers. Okay, we'll open this file, and then we'll modify this program with the best practices. Well, think for a second, how can you improve this code and how can you implement the best practices that you have just learned? Think for a second, go through the program and see what modifications you can come up with. You have to think through this, because if you have understood the concepts that has been taught previously, then you should know by now what can be modified in this program. So take this as an exercise and a use case for you to understand this concept. Okay, the first good practice is you should not define your property public, and you should try not to give them access directly from outside, because anybody can change working days. Instead of working days that you hard coded as 8 hours per day, they can change to 20 hours and 100 hours, and then the salary will get incremented. Okay, so you have to restrict them first, and you can restrict them via the private keyword. Okay, you can restrict them everything as private. Okay, now think which of the methods you want to give them the access, not setting but getting the methods. Which of the methods you want to just access those variables, just define them. Okay, don't define everything, or don't define all the getter and setter methods. Okay, so I want to have them access to get the name. Okay, so you can say, okay, so this can get the name, and if you see the constructor, you're already setting the name via the constructor, so you don't have to mention the setter method. Okay, next you want to get the working days. Okay, if you look below, we have been accessing the working days here. Okay, so we can say, okay, you can access this value of the working days. And what is the other method that you want to define is the get total leave taken. Okay, that's what we have been used here, and we can return this value. Okay, so now you have defined 3 methods using which you can access the value of that property. Okay, so now you can go ahead and change this name to get name. Okay, you can say get name, and then you can say get working days, and then you can say get total leave taken. Okay, and you can see the code looks much easier now. You're not accessing any of the property directly, and also you have hidden some of the property to be accessed from the outside. You cannot now change them, it's hard coded in the program. And then you have some methods given for you to access those values of the property. Okay, you can go ahead and change the same thing for employee 2. Okay, and let's print this. So for this name, you can even say get name. Oh, and one more thing is you cannot have method inside the string, so you have to mark it outside. Okay, so let's copy this, paste it to this. Okay, so I hope now you can print the employee. Yeah, you can print the employee details now. The code remains the same. We haven't touched any of the core logic of the code. We have just improved our code. This is from the coding standpoint. And then we have also followed some of the access modify here. We have changed from public to private, and then we have given some methods. We haven't mentioned public here. Okay, if you don't mention, by default the methods are public. Well, this is a good practice that you can follow in your OOPS programming by creating the private properties and give the public methods to access them. You can also see the code that there's no property being accessed directly. That's basically a good practice. Okay, so that's all on this lecture on use case of how to improve an employee class with access modifiers, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the exercise. I want you to do an exercise on the bank class and try to use the private and the public concept, and also try to use some of the concepts that we have learned previously. I want to try out again with the public and the private access modifier. Okay, so you have to write a bank class, you have to define a balance as a property, and make sure you hide it so that it cannot be accessed via the object, means from the outside. You define public methods, get balance, deposit amount, and deduct amount, and you set the initial balance via the constructor. So you're learning a couple of things here. You're learning how to use a constructor. You're also using some of the public methods, and then you are trying to use a private access modifier here, and then you're trying to write a bank class with all the concepts that you have learned so far. Okay, so pause the video here and do this exercise now. So welcome back. So let's do an exercise. So let's create the bank class. So let's define the class. The first thing is you have to define the property as a balance and make sure it's not accessible, so make it as private. Okay, now you can write the functions of get balance. And you have public functions you can write the constructor and don't mention the access modifier for the constructor, and we will pass the initial balance. This is the initial balance that you can set to the property of the bank. This is the initial amount of the account holder when the account is been created. Okay, so let's define two functions. Deposit amount, you have the balance here, and then you can say okay, let's do the deduct amount. You can have the amount here as well. Okay, so let's write the deduct amount logic here. So I'll copy paste the code here. This we have seen previously. If the balance is less than 0, then you say there's no balance. You would have to return the instance. Just say return. Okay, and then you can deduct the amount when your balance is greater than the amount. Okay, so this is done. So let's start executing the code via the object now. So bank1 is equal to new bank, and you have to pass the balance. So initial balance is 100. Now you will say bank1 get balance. This is the method. Now you can deposit the amount. Let's say 500. You're checking the balance, then you're deducting the amount of 500, and then you're checking the balance. Okay, just add the new lines here. Okay, so let's execute this code. Okay, so that's the 100, 600 and 100. Okay, first you add 500 to 100, 600, then you deduct 500, then it becomes 100 again. Okay, so the most important thing that you have to understand is no one can change the balance. Okay, there's no method for you to change the balance, right? You can only change the balance via the deposit amount. So when there's a transaction, only this method can be called, and you have no direct access to balance. So if you try to access the balance and change it to some value, it will error it out. Means it says you have no direct access to any of the properties. Okay, you have to go via this method, and in this method you can actually write all the checks whether the transaction is correct, you have a transaction ID, you know, all those details of a proper authentication and authorization has been done. Then only you deposit that amount into the bank account, and no one can take a shortcut to change the properties by accessing this class. Okay, so that's the purpose of hiding the things from the class and make sure it's not visible from the outside the class. Okay, however, it's visible inside the class, but to hide the things from outside the class, you use the access modifier. Okay, and this is a very best example to see how the variable can be hidden and what is the best case where you can really hide the variables. And in the bank class, you have to hide the property called as balance. You have to hide that, and no one should be able to directly access it and modify it. That's where the private access modifier will help you to do that. Okay, so that's all on the exercise on access modifiers, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the assignment section. So it's assignment time now. So in this assignment, we will practice access modifiers. So what I want to do is I want you to create a car class by using the access modifiers public and private. So you define property as private, you define getter and setter methods to access them, you define some public methods like increase speed and decrease speed, and then you have to define a property called speed using which you can increase and decrease it. Okay, so do this exercise, create the class, and then once you are done, execute it. If everything is successful, share that code with me in the Q&A section, then I'll be happy to give a review and feedback on that code. Okay, so do a practice and understand how to work with access modifiers. All the best for your assignment, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the summary section of access modifiers. So by now you should be able to understand what is access modifiers. You should be able to work with examples understanding private and public access modifiers. You should also understand when to use which modifier, and you should know the difference when someone asks you what is the difference between public and private access modifiers. And I hope you have worked through exercises and assignments to understand this concept better. Okay, so that's all in this lecture for access modifiers, and I'll see you in the next one.